There was once a sound that haunted Robert Caldwell more than any silence ever could. The echo of his own laughter, cold and hollow, reverberating through the marble halls of his Chicago mansion like a ghost refusing to rest. It was the kind of laughter that came not from joy, but from the deepest well of cynicism, born from years of watching hope crumble into dust. Perhaps you're listening to this from your own quiet corner of the world, maybe holding a cup of coffee that's grown cold while memories dance at the edges of your mind. Maybe you've forgotten what it feels like to believe in something beyond what your eyes can see, beyond what your wounded heart can accept. Time doesn't matter right now, neither does place. What matters is that today's story will remind you that miracles still walk among us, often wearing the smallest shoes and speaking in the gentlest voices. In the shadow of Chicago's towering skyline, where steel and glass pierce the heavens like modern-day monuments to ambition, Robert Caldwell's name was whispered in boardrooms from Wall Street to Michigan Avenue. His investment portfolio read like a map of American prosperity, real estate holdings spanning 3 states, cryptocurrency wallets heavy with Bitcoin, stock market positions that would make seasoned traders weep with envy. His net worth, calculated in the tens of millions, was the kind of wealth that could buy anything money touched. But money, Robert had learned, could not purchase the sound of a child's laughter echoing through empty rooms. The Caldwell mansion sat perched above Lake Michigan like a fortress of solitude, its windows reflecting the city's lights, but never seeming to let them in. Inside, grandfather clocks ticked with mechanical precision, their pendulums swinging back and forth in rhythm with Robert's measured footsteps across marble floors that hadn't known the pitter-patter of small feet in over a decade. The walls were lined with photographs frozen in silver frames, images of a little girl with pigtails and gap-toothed smiles, captured in moments that felt like ancient history. Her name had been Lily, and she had been Robert's entire world until the accident took her away, leaving behind only echoes and the suffocating weight of what-ifs that pressed against his chest with every breath. The fortune that Robert had built from nothing, starting with a small investment firm in his 20s that grew into a financial empire, had become both his shield and his prison. Every dollar earned, every successful merger, every shrewd investment decision had been driven by the need to provide for Lily, to build a legacy worthy of her bright future. Now, surrounded by the fruits of his relentless ambition, he walked through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. The kitchen, once filled with the aroma of pancakes and the sound of Lily's chatter about school friends, now housed a refrigerator stocked with meals he barely touched. The living room, where they used to build pillow forts and read bedtime stories, was now a sterile space with furniture positioned at precise angles, as if even the sofas were afraid to disturb the oppressive quiet. Robert's days followed a pattern as rigid as his investment schedules. Morning coffee taken alone while reviewing market reports that confirmed his wealth continued to multiply. Afternoon calls with portfolio managers who spoke in numbers that once excited him, but now felt as hollow as autumn leaves. Evening walks through his private garden, where even the carefully manicured roses seemed to bloom without joy. His personal staff, a housekeeper who cleaned rooms that were never lived in, a chef who prepared meals for one, a groundskeeper who tended gardens no child would ever play in, moved through the mansion like polite ghosts, speaking in whispers as if afraid to disturb the shrine to grief that the house had become. The accident replayed in Robert's mind with the clarity of a high-definition nightmare. A rainy Tuesday evening, Lily running ahead toward the ice cream truck, her small hand slipping from his as she darted into the street. The screech of brakes that came too late, the sickening thud that would echo in his dreams forever. In the years since, Robert had thrown himself into his business with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. His investment firm expanded, his wealth multiplied, his reputation grew, all of it meaningless weight that couldn't fill the lily-shaped hole in his soul. The autumn wind carried more than the promise of winter when it brought Anna Martinez to the iron gates of the Caldwell estate. She stood there on a Tuesday afternoon, her small figure dwarfed by the towering fence posts, her dark eyes gazing up at the mansion with an expression that seemed far too knowing for her 8 years. Her clothes told the story of Chicago's South Side, faded jeans with patches on the knees, a sweater that had seen too many washings, sneakers that had walked too many miles on unforgiving concrete. But there was something about her presence that made the afternoon light seem softer, something that caused the autumn leaves to dance a little more gracefully in the wind around her feet. Anna lived in a world that existed in sharp contrast to Robert's marble sanctuary. Her home was a small apartment on Pilsen Street, where the rent ate up most of her mother Susan's paycheck from the diner where she worked double shifts. Their refrigerator was often empty, their heat sometimes cut off, their future always uncertain. But Anna carried herself with a quiet dignity that poverty couldn't touch, a sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from some deep well of understanding that defied her years. Her mother Susan had noticed it early, the way Anna would know things before they happened, the way animals gravitated toward her as if drawn by some invisible force, the way she could calm crying babies with just a look. Susan, practical and worn down by life's harsh realities, had learned not to read too much into her daughter's strange gifts. In a world where miracles were a luxury she couldn't afford to believe in, Susan focused on the tangible, keeping Anna fed, clothed, safe, and in school. Robert first encountered Anna during one of his rare ventures beyond the estate's walls. He had been walking through Lincoln Park, moving with the measured pace of a man who exercised his body while his spirit remained motionless. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant fireplaces. He noticed her sitting on a bench, drawing in a notebook with careful concentration. When their eyes met, she smiled with the unself-conscious warmth that only children possess, a smile that seemed to crack something in the frozen landscape of Robert's heart. "You look sad," she said simply, as if sadness were a visible thing, like the color of his expensive overcoat or the silver threading through his dark hair. Her voice carried the slight accent of her Hispanic heritage, mixed with the straightforward honesty of Chicago's streets. Robert's first reaction was the defensive laugh that had become his trademark response to anything that threatened to penetrate his carefully constructed emotional armor. The sound emerged from his throat like broken glass, sharp and cutting, designed to wound before he could be wounded. "Sad?" he repeated, his voice carrying the condescension that came naturally to a man accustomed to boardroom victories. "Young lady, I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm Robert Caldwell. Perhaps you've heard the name?" The October wind seemed to pause around them, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Anna tilted her head, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see past his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair, past the trappings of wealth and success, straight to the hollow ache he carried like a stone in his chest. "Money doesn't fix everything," she said softly, her small hand still holding the worn pencil she'd been using to draw. "Sometimes it just builds higher walls." The observation hit Robert like a physical blow. This child, this small girl who probably didn't know the difference between stocks and bonds, who had likely never seen the inside of a luxury car, much less owned one, had summarized his existence with devastating accuracy. His carefully constructed fortress of wealth had indeed become a prison, and the bars were made of everything he thought he'd wanted. "What would you know about it?" he asked, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow to his own ears. His usual weapons, his wealth, his reputation, his ability to intimidate, seemed powerless against this child's quiet certainty. Anna closed her notebook and stood, brushing fallen leaves from her patched jeans. She was so small that the bench had barely held her weight, so young that Robert found himself wondering if she should be in school instead of sitting alone in the park. But there was nothing childlike about the wisdom in her eyes as she looked up at him. "I know that hearts can break even when wallets are full," she said. "I know that some people build museums instead of homes. And I know that sadness has a sound. It's the sound of clocks ticking in empty rooms. Robert felt his breath catch in his throat. How could this child know about the clocks? How could she possibly understand the suffocating rhythm that marked his days, the mechanical heartbeat of a home that had forgotten how to live? Before he could form a response, Anna was walking away, her small figure moving with surprising grace along the park's winding path. She turned back once, just before disappearing around a bend lined with oak trees, and called out, "I'll see you again, Mr. Caldwell. Some meetings are written in the stars before we're born." Over the following weeks, Robert found himself drawn back to Lincoln Park with a compulsion he couldn't explain or control. His rational mind, the same calculating intelligence that had built his financial empire, told him he was being foolish. What was he hoping to accomplish by seeking out a chance encounter with a child? What possible relevance could the observations of an 8-year-old have to his life? But rationality seemed to have little power against the growing curiosity that pulled him toward the park each afternoon. He began to vary his route, taking different paths through the carefully landscaped grounds, past the zoo entrance where families gathered with their children, past the lagoon where couples rented paddle boats, past the playground where children's laughter rose and fell like music he'd forgotten how to hear. And each day, Anna was there. Sometimes she sat on the same bench where they'd first met. Sometimes she stood by the lagoon feeding ducks with breadcrumbs that looked like they'd come from her own meager lunch. She never seemed surprised to see him, never acted as though their meetings were anything other than the most natural thing in the world. Gradually, despite his best efforts to maintain his emotional distance, Robert found himself looking forward to these encounters. Anna had a way of speaking that was both childlike and ancient, as if she possessed knowledge that had been gathering for lifetimes. She told him stories about the ducks on the lagoon, about the way trees whispered secrets to each other through their roots, about the patterns that clouds made when they were trying to tell people important messages. "Do you see that one?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to a cloud formation that, to Robert's eyes, looked like nothing more than accumulated water vapor. "It looks like a little girl dancing. She's been waiting for someone to notice her." Robert squinted at the sky, trying to see what Anna saw, but the clouds remained shapeless and meaningless to him. "I don't see anything," he admitted, surprised by his own disappointment. "That's okay," Anna said with the patient tone of someone much older. "Sometimes we have to remember how to see before we can see the important things. It takes practice, like learning to play music." She pulled out her notebook and began sketching the cloud formation with careful strokes. As Robert watched, the seemingly random lines began to take shape under her pencil, and suddenly he could see it. A small figure with arms outstretched, hair flowing in an invisible wind, captured in a moment of pure joy. The first crack in Robert's skepticism appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when Anna seemed to make the storm itself pause just by raising her hand toward the dark clouds overhead. They had been caught in Lincoln Park when the autumn deluge began, heavy drops that turned the paths into streams and sent other park visitors running for shelter. Robert, dressed in his perfectly tailored wool coat, had started toward the parking garage where his Mercedes waited, expecting Anna to follow. Instead, she stood in the center of the path, rain plastering her dark hair to her head, her thin sweater soaked through. She tilted her face toward the sky as if she were drinking starlight instead of cold rainwater, and whispered something in Spanish that Robert couldn't understand. For a moment, just a single, impossible moment, the rain seemed to stop falling directly above them. The drops continued their assault on the trees around them, on the grass at their feet, on the rest of the park that stretched in all directions. But in the small circle where they stood, the air was suddenly still, as if they existed in the eye of a very localized storm. Robert blinked hard, certain that the stress of recent months had finally caused him to have some kind of breakdown. Men in his position didn't believe in impossible things. His portfolio included shares in pharmaceutical companies that developed medications for delusions exactly like this. But when he opened his eyes, Anna was looking at him with a smile that seemed to contain entire galaxies of understanding. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain that continued to fall everywhere except where they stood, The world takes a breath, just for a moment, just to let us know we're not alone. The impossible pause lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the rain resumed its normal pattern, soaking them both to the skin as if making up for lost time. Anna laughed, not the bitter sound that Robert had perfected, but the genuine music of a child who found joy in simple mysteries. She took his hand with her small, rain-cold fingers and led him toward the shelter of an old oak tree whose branches provided minimal protection from the storm. "How did you do that?" Robert heard himself ask, his voice hoarse with an emotion he couldn't name. Anna squeezed his hand gently. "I didn't do anything," she said. "Sometimes miracles just happen when people need them most. The trick is being ready to see them." Robert stood under that oak tree, expensive suit dripping, investment portfolio momentarily forgotten, and felt something shift inside his chest. It was subtle, like the first crack of ice at the beginning of spring, but unmistakable. For the first time in years, he wondered if there might be more to the world than balance sheets and quarterly reports. Each afternoon brought new impossibilities that Robert's rational mind struggled to process and dismiss. Anna had a way of being present during moments that defied logical explanation, and her presence seemed to act as a catalyst for events that belonged more in fairy tales than in the ordered world of financial markets and investment strategies. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, Robert discovered Anna in his own garden. He hadn't invited her. The estate's security system hadn't recorded any breach of the perimeter. Yet, there she was, sitting cross-legged beneath the fountain that hadn't worked in years, humming a melody that seemed to make the dried roses lift their heads as if remembering how to bloom. The fountain itself, an elaborate marble piece that had cost more than most people's annual salaries and had been silent since Lily's death, began to trickle with the faintest flow of water. "How did you get in here?" Robert asked, but his voice lacked the anger or concern that should have accompanied finding an intruder on his property. Instead, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if Anna belonged in this space more than he did. "I walked through the garden gate," she said simply. It was open. Robert knew with absolute certainty that the garden gate had been locked. He checked it himself every evening as part of his routine, one of the many security measures that helped him maintain the illusion of control over his environment. Yet Anna's presence here seemed so natural that he found himself questioning his own certainty rather than her impossible explanation. She had brought breadcrumbs again, and as she scattered them on the ground, birds appeared from nowhere. Not just the usual urban sparrows and pigeons, but cardinals and blue jays, a small hawk that perched fearlessly on the fountain's edge, even a family of geese that must have wandered up from the lakeshore. They ate peacefully around her, natural enemies sitting side by side as if they'd forgotten they were supposed to fear each other. "They're hungry," Anna explained, as though the behavior of wild birds gathering at her feet was the most normal thing in the world. "Winter's coming, and they need to remember they're not alone." Robert watched this impossible scene unfold in his own backyard, where nothing had lived or thrived since Lily's death, where even the professional groundskeepers struggled to keep plants alive. The sight of so much life converging around this small girl made his throat tight with an emotion he'd spent years learning to suppress. "Animals don't usually behave like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. "They do when they feel safe," she said. "Everything wants to feel safe. Even the scared ones, even the ones who've forgotten how." The words hit Robert like a diagnosis of his own condition. When was the last time he'd felt safe? When had he stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a problem to be managed, a fortune to be protected, a reputation to be maintained? The growing bond between Robert and Anna created ripples that extended far beyond the confines of Lincoln Park. Susan Martinez, Anna's mother, had begun to notice changes in her daughter's routine and demeanor that both concerned and puzzled her. Anna would return from her afternoon wanderings with stories about a sad man who was learning to see clouds again, about conversations that seemed to transform both participants in ways Susan couldn't quite understand. Susan's life was built on practical foundations that left little room for mystical interpretations. Her world consisted of morning shifts at the diner, where she served coffee and eggs to construction workers and office clerks, afternoon hours when she cleaned houses in Lincoln Park for wealthy families who paid her fairly but barely noticed her existence, and evenings spent helping Anna with homework at their small kitchen table under fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. She had learned early that survival required focus on tangible realities: rent money, grocery bills, Anna's school supplies, the accumulating balance of her own deferred dreams. Yet, she couldn't ignore the changes in Anna. Her daughter returned from her daily adventures calmer, more centered, carrying herself with a sense of purpose that seemed too mature for her years. Anna spoke about her new friend with a tenderness that suggested something profound was developing, and Susan found herself torn between maternal protectiveness and curiosity about this mysterious man who seemed to be having such a positive effect on her child. One evening, when Chicago's early winter wind was rattling their apartment windows, Anna asked if she could invite Mr. Caldwell for dinner. The request was made with the innocent directness that children possess, as if inviting millionaires to eat at card tables in cramped apartments was a perfectly reasonable social exchange. "Mija," Susan said gently, using the endearment that always made Anna feel wrapped in warmth. "Rich people don't come to places like this. They have their own world, their own friends. It's better if you understand that now." But Anna's expression remained serene, untouched by the social realities that governed Susan's understanding of class boundaries. "He's not really rich," she said with the quiet certainty that had become her trademark. "He just has a lot of money." "There's a difference." Susan felt her heart constrict with protective love for her daughter's innocence, even as she recognized the wisdom embedded in Anna's distinction. How had this small girl learned to see past surfaces that fooled most adults? Where did her insights come from? And why did they always seem to reveal truths that Susan herself hadn't fully grasped? The invitation came in the form of a hand-drawn card that Anna slipped through the mail slot of Robert's mansion on a Friday evening when Lake Michigan's waves crashed against the shore with unusual violence. The drawing showed stick figures sitting around a table with careful labels identifying Mr. Caldwell, Anna, and Mama. The message, written in Anna's careful cursive, was simple. "Would you like to have dinner with us on Sunday? We don't have much, but we have enough to share. Love, Anna." Robert held the card for a long time, sitting in his study surrounded by financial reports that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to this small gesture. The invitation represented everything his wealth had failed to provide: genuine human connection, uncomplicated kindness, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who wanted nothing from him except his company. Yet accepting would mean crossing boundaries that his social position had established, venturing into a world where his money couldn't purchase comfort or control outcomes. Sunday evening found Robert standing outside a weathered apartment building on Pilsen Street, holding a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Susan's monthly rent payment. The neighborhood pulsed with life in ways his gated community never had. Children playing in courtyards despite the cold, music drifting from open windows, the mingled aromas of dozens of different dinners being prepared with care and hope. The building's lobby smelled of cleaning products and humanity, of lives being lived in close quarters without the buffer of wealth and space. Susan answered the door, wearing her best dress, a simple black garment that she'd owned since before Anna was born but had maintained with meticulous care. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but cautious, her eyes carrying the wariness of someone who had learned that people generally wanted something in exchange for their attention. The apartment was tiny by Robert's standards but immaculate, every surface clean and organized, every decorative touch chosen with care despite obvious budget constraints. Family photographs covered one wall, pictures of Anna at various ages, school events, Birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and handmade gifts. The small dining table was set with mismatched plates and glasses, cloth napkins that had been carefully ironed, candles that filled the space with warm light. The dinner itself was simple: roasted chicken, rice with beans, vegetables that Susan had selected carefully from the grocery store's discount rack. But the flavors were rich with love and attention, seasoned with spices that carried the memory of Susan's childhood, served with the pride of someone who had created something beautiful from modest ingredients. Anna sat between them, chattering about school and friends and the stray cat she'd been feeding near the park, serving as translator between two adults from different worlds. As winter settled over Chicago with its characteristic intensity, the unlikely friendship between Robert and Anna deepened into something that transcended their obvious differences in age, background, and resources. Their meetings had evolved from chance encounters to deliberate appointments, and Robert found himself structuring his days around the hours he could spend in Anna's presence. The child had a way of creating sacred space wherever she went, transforming mundane locations into places where genuine communication could occur. They met at the Art Institute, where Anna showed Robert how to see paintings with fresh eyes, pointing out details that revealed stories within stories. They walked through Millennium Park, where Anna somehow convinced the usually aloof city birds to eat from her hands, while Robert watched in amazement. They sat in coffee shops, where Anna ordered hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and Robert found himself ordering the same thing, abandoning his usual black coffee for the simple pleasure of sharing sweetness with someone who appreciated it completely. During these meetings, Robert began to share pieces of his story that he had never voiced aloud. He told Anna about Lily, about the daughter who had filled his world with laughter and purpose, about the accident that had torn his universe apart, about the years of guilt and grief that had followed. Anna listened with the complete attention that children give to stories that matter, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of his pain without causing additional wounds. "Do you think she's still with you?" Anna asked one afternoon as they sat in the conservatory, surrounded by tropical plants that bloomed defiantly despite the frozen landscape outside. "Sometimes I feel like people we love don't really go away. They just become invisible for a while." The question pierced Robert's carefully maintained composure. In all his years of therapy, all his attempts to process his grief through expensive professional help, no one had ever asked him such a direct question about his continued connection to Lily. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I want to believe that, but wanting something doesn't make it true." Anna reached over and took his hand with her small, warm fingers. "Maybe wanting is the first step toward believing," she said. "Maybe belief starts with hoping, and hoping starts with missing someone so much that you can't accept they're really gone." These conversations began to create fissures in the emotional walls Robert had built around his heart. Anna had a gift for asking questions that revealed the difference between his public face and his private truth, for creating space where honesty felt safer than pretense. Gradually, almost without his conscious awareness, Robert began to change. His housekeeper noticed that he'd started leaving his curtains open, letting natural light into rooms that had been artificially illuminated for years. His chef reported that he'd begun eating meals at the kitchen table instead of in his study, sometimes even requesting foods that weren't on his usual austere menu. The crisis that would test everything Robert and Anna had built together arrived with the December snow in the form of Patricia Caldwell Morrison, Robert's sister, and the closest thing he had to family. Patricia had built her own successful career as a corporate attorney, and she wielded her protection of Robert's interests with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to hostile takeovers and contractual negotiations. Her concern for her brother was genuine, but filtered through a worldview that left no room for mysteries or miracles, where every relationship could be reduced to its financial implications and every friendship analyzed for ulterior motives. Patricia had been monitoring Robert's activities with increasing alarm as reports reached her about his unusual friendship with a child from Chicago's South Side. Her private investigator had provided her with detailed information about Anna and Susan Martinez, their financial struggles, their lack of social connections that might provide them with influence or access, their apparent need for exactly the kind of help that a wealthy man might provide. In Patricia's experience, need was always accompanied by the desire to exploit, and innocence was generally a performance designed to lower the defenses of potential benefactors. She arrived at Robert's mansion on a Tuesday evening when Lake Michigan was churning with winter storms, armed with legal documents and moral certainty. Her argument was logical, carefully constructed, and delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to winning difficult cases. "Robert," she said, settling into the leather chair in his study with the confidence of someone who belonged there, "I'm worried about you. This relationship you've developed with this child, it's not healthy. It's not appropriate. And frankly, it's making you vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation that wealthy men in emotional distress often face." She had done her homework. Anna's mother worked multiple jobs but still struggled to pay rent on time. Anna's school records showed academic promise, but also indicated a child who would benefit from private tutoring and educational opportunities that her family couldn't afford. The family had no health insurance adequate to cover any serious medical emergencies. In Patricia's analysis, these were all pressure points that could be used to manipulate a grieving man into making poor financial and emotional decisions. "These people see you as a solution to their problems," Patricia continued, her voice gentle but implacable. "The child has been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to present herself as exactly what you need, a replacement daughter figure who can help you process your grief. It's textbook manipulation, Robert, and I can't stand by and watch you be taken advantage of when you're clearly not thinking clearly." The words hit Robert like physical blows. Patricia was articulating every doubt he'd suppressed, giving voice to every suspicion his rational mind had generated and discarded. How could he explain Anna's impossible knowledge, her uncanny ability to appear at moments when he needed her most, her way of speaking that seemed to come from sources deeper than her limited life experience? The confrontation that would temporarily shatter the fragile world Robert and Anna had created occurred on a snowy afternoon in Lincoln Park when Patricia arranged to be present during one of their regular meetings. She had insisted on witnessing firsthand what she termed this inappropriate relationship, arriving in her Mercedes sedan with a court reporter and a child psychologist she had retained to evaluate Anna's mental state and the dynamics of her interaction with Robert. Anna was feeding the ducks at the lagoon when they approached, her small figure bundled in the warm coat that Robert had bought her after noticing she'd been shivering during their previous meetings. She looked up as the group approached, her dark eyes taking in Patricia's expensive wool coat, the official bearing of the court reporter, the clinical gaze of the psychologist. If she felt intimidated by this display of adult authority, she showed no sign of it. "Hello, Mr. Caldwell," she said with her usual warm smile. "I brought extra bread today. The ducks are getting ready for the really cold weather, and they need to eat more." Patricia stepped forward with the commanding presence she used in boardrooms and courtrooms. "Anna, I'm Patricia, Mr. Caldwell's sister. I've been wanting to meet you." Her tone was friendly but formal, carrying an undercurrent of evaluation that Anna seemed to sense immediately. "I'm wondering if we could talk about your friendship with my brother. I'm concerned about whether this relationship is healthy for either of you." The child psychologist began asking Anna questions designed to probe her understanding of appropriate boundaries, her family situation, her motivations for seeking out Robert's company. Anna answered with patient honesty, explaining that she enjoyed their talks, that Robert seemed sad and she wanted to help him feel better, that her mother had taught her to be kind to people who were hurting. But the clinical nature of the interrogation began to strip away the magic that had surrounded their friendship. Under the harsh light of professional scrutiny, Anna's insights began to sound like precocious manipulation. Her empathy became calculated emotional intelligence. Her mysterious knowledge transformed into the kind of leading statements that troubled children sometimes used to gain adult attention. Robert watched this systematic dismantling of everything he'd come to cherish, feeling helpless rage build in his chest. Yet part of him, the part trained in financial analysis and risk assessment, recognized the validity of Patricia's concerns. How could he prove that Anna's impact on his life was genuine rather than carefully orchestrated? How could he demonstrate that her wisdom came from authentic insight rather than sophisticated coaching? When the psychologist asked Anna to explain how she knew things about Robert's home that she shouldn't have known, how she seemed to appear in places where she shouldn't have been able to gain access, the child's answers sounded thin and unconvincing even to Robert's ears. "I just know things sometimes," Anna said, her voice smaller than usual, as she faced this wall of adult skepticism. "People's feelings are like colors around them. Mr. Caldwell's feelings were dark colors when I first met him, but now they're getting brighter. I wanted to help because helping people makes the world more beautiful." Patricia exchanged glances with the psychologist, and Robert saw his worst fears reflected in their expressions. They saw a troubled child creating fantasies to cope with her family's financial stress, potentially being coached by a desperate mother to exploit a vulnerable, wealthy man's grief. The magic Robert had experienced was being systematically explained away as psychological pathology and economic desperation. The separation that followed Patricia's intervention felt like a second death in Robert's life. Legal documents were drafted restricting his contact with Anna and her family. Restraining orders were filed to prevent what Patricia termed further emotional manipulation, and surveillance was increased around the estate to ensure compliance with these new boundaries. Anna disappeared from Lincoln Park, from the conservatory, from all the places where their friendship had flourished. Robert found himself once again walking through empty spaces, but now the silence carried additional weight, not just the absence of Lily's laughter, but the loss of Anna's gentle presence that had begun to heal wounds he'd thought were permanent. The mansion returned to its previous state of perfect, lifeless order. The fountain in the garden fell silent once more. The birds stopped visiting. The plants seemed to lose their vibrancy. Robert's days resumed their old pattern of mechanical routine, punctuated by financial reports and investment calls that felt increasingly meaningless. Yet something had changed irrevocably. The crack in his emotional armor that Anna had created couldn't be sealed completely. He found himself remembering her observations, hearing her voice during quiet moments, seeing glimpses of the world through her eyes even in her absence. The skepticism that Patricia had instilled warred constantly with his lived experience of Anna's impact on his life. Had he been deceived? Had his grief made him vulnerable to manipulation? Or had he encountered something genuine that his rational mind was simply incapable of processing? Winter deepened into its most brutal phase, and Robert's isolation became more profound than ever before. The protective measures Patricia had implemented successfully prevented any direct contact with Anna or her family, but they couldn't silence the questions that haunted his thoughts. What had Anna meant when she spoke about people's feelings having colors? How had she known about the stopped clocks in his house? Why had her presence seemed to create space where peace was possible? 3 weeks after their forced separation, Robert received news that Anna had been hospitalized with pneumonia, a consequence of Chicago's harsh winter and her family's inability to afford adequate heating in their apartment. The information came through private investigators Patricia had hired to monitor the situation, presented as evidence that the Martinez family's financial desperation made them inherently unreliable and potentially dangerous to Robert's emotional well-being. Yet instead of validating Patricia's concerns, the news of Anna's illness created a crisis of conscience that Robert couldn't ignore. While legal documents prevented him from visiting or contacting the family directly, they couldn't prevent him from thinking about a small girl lying in a hospital bed, possibly afraid and certainly separated from everything familiar during her recovery. The revelation that would transform Robert's understanding of everything he'd experienced came in the form of a simple manila envelope slipped under his front door during a blizzard that made Chicago streets impassable and kept even the most dedicated security personnel safely indoors. Inside the envelope was a letter written in Anna's careful cursive, accompanied by a drawing that made Robert's hands shake as he studied it. The letter was brief but profound in its implications. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," it read, "I know we're not supposed to talk anymore, and I understand why the lawyer lady thinks I'm not good for you. But I had to tell you something important before I couldn't tell you anymore. I dream about a little girl who looks like you. She has your eyes and your smile, but happier. She says to tell you she never left. She just learned to speak different. Sometimes love finds new ways to visit people who need it. I think maybe I was her way of showing you that love doesn't end when people die. It just changes shape. The drawing is something I saw in my dreams. I think you'll remember it. Thank you for being my friend and for letting me be yours. I hope your heart remembers how to hear music again. Love, Anna." The drawing showed a small girl with pigtails standing beside a fountain where water flowed freely, surrounded by roses that bloomed in impossible gardens where time moved in spirals rather than straight lines. But it was the details that made Robert's breath catch in his throat. The specific pattern of the little girl's dress, the exact angle of her head as she looked toward something beyond the viewer's sight, the way her hair caught light that seemed to come from multiple sources. These were details from photographs he'd never shown Anna, memories from moments he'd never described to anyone, visual elements from dreams that had haunted him since Lily's death. The drawing wasn't just remarkably accurate, it was impossible. Anna couldn't have known these things through any conventional means, yet there they were, captured in careful pencil strokes that suggested either extraordinary coincidence or something that transcended logical explanation. Robert carried the letter and drawing to his study, where he sat surrounded by the financial reports that had once defined his existence. But instead of market analyses and investment strategies, he found himself studying Anna's words and artwork, searching for rational explanations that became increasingly elusive. The child's suggestion that love finds new ways to visit people who need it created a framework for understanding experiences he'd been unable to categorize. What if Anna's impossible knowledge hadn't been manipulation or coincidence, but something more profound? What if her presence in his life had been exactly what she'd claimed, love learning to speak in a new language? The blizzard that had made communication possible by creating a gap in security coverage continued to rage outside, transforming Chicago into a white landscape where ordinary rules seemed suspended. Robert found himself walking through his mansion with Anna's letter in his hand, seeing familiar spaces with new eyes. The stopped clocks that had marked time's suspension since Lily's death, the photographs that had become shrines to loss, the silence that had felt like death itself. All of it began to look different when viewed through Anna's perspective. Over the following days, as Chicago slowly dug itself out from the blizzard's embrace, Robert found himself experiencing changes that he could only describe as miraculous. The transformation began subtly, a loosening of the chronic tension that had lived in his shoulders for years, a sense of lightness that had nothing to do with his physical condition. He woke one morning and realized that for the first time since Lily's death, he'd slept through the entire night without being awakened by nightmares or guilt-induced insomnia. But the changes became more dramatic as the days passed. Robert discovered that he could walk distances that had been impossible during the years since his grief had settled into his body like a physical illness. The chronic fatigue that had made even simple activities exhausting began to lift, replaced by an energy that felt both familiar and entirely new. His appetite returned, and food began to taste like nourishment rather than obligation. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried more meaning. The winter sunlight streaming through his windows felt warm against his skin in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Most remarkably, the oppressive silence that had filled his mansion for years began to transform into a different kind of quiet, not the dead silence of a mausoleum, but the peaceful silence of a space where healing was taking place. The grandfather clocks that had ticked mechanically without meaning began to sound like heartbeats, keeping time with life rather than marking its passage toward death. The photographs of Lily, that had been painful reminders of loss, started to feel like loving presents, memories that brought comfort rather than despair. Robert's staff noticed the changes immediately. His housekeeper found him humming while reading morning reports, something she hadn't witnessed in the entire decade she'd worked for him. His chef reported that Robert had started making specific meal requests, showing interest in flavors and textures that suggested someone who was rediscovering pleasure in simple experiences. The groundskeeper was amazed to find Robert working in the garden without being asked, tending dormant plants with the careful attention of someone who believed in the possibility of renewal. These changes occurred without explanation or conscious effort on Robert's part. He felt like someone recovering from a long illness, gradually remembering what it meant to inhabit his body fully, rather than simply carrying it through necessary motions. The financial reports that had once commanded his complete attention began to feel less urgent, less definitional of his worth and purpose. His investment portfolio continued to perform well. His business acumen hadn't disappeared, but money had somehow returned to its proper role as a tool rather than a master. Patricia, monitoring her brother's situation from a distance, observed these changes with a mixture of relief and concern. The emotional crisis that had prompted her intervention seemed to be resolving, but she couldn't determine whether this represented genuine healing or a more sophisticated form of psychological denial. Her reports from the private investigators confirmed that Robert had maintained no direct contact with the Martinez family. Yet, his improvement seemed to coincide perfectly with the period following his separation from Anna. The encounter that would bring clarity to Robert's transformation occurred on a February morning when Lake Michigan was partially frozen and the city wore winter's beauty like a crown of crystal and light. Robert had been walking through Lincoln Park, not searching for anyone specific, but drawn by a restlessness that felt more like anticipation than anxiety. The park was nearly empty due to the cold, with only the most dedicated joggers and dog walkers sharing the paths that crunched beneath his feet with satisfying winter sounds. He found Anna sitting on their old bench by the lagoon, bundled in the warm coat he'd given her, looking perfectly healthy and serene despite the pneumonia that had supposedly hospitalized her weeks earlier. Her presence in this place where she was legally forbidden to be should have alarmed him, should have triggered calls to security or Patricia. Instead, Robert felt only a profound sense of rightness, as if the universe had finally aligned properly after months of chaotic displacement. "Hello, Mr. Caldwell," Anna said with her familiar warm smile, as though no separation had occurred, as though no legal restrictions existed, as though their meeting in this moment was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm glad you're walking farther now. Your steps sound happier." Robert sat beside her on the bench, ignoring every rational voice in his head that told him this meeting violated multiple court orders and could result in serious legal consequences. "Anna," he said, his voice carrying questions he couldn't quite formulate. "How are you here?" "I was told you were in the hospital. I was everywhere I needed to be," she replied with that simple directness that had always cut through his confusion. Sometimes being sick helps people understand what being healthy really means. Sometimes being apart helps people understand what being together really means. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another drawing, this one showing two figures walking together through a garden where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and time moved in gentle spirals. The man in the drawing looked familiar, but transformed. His face carried the same features as Robert's, but radiated peace instead of pain, purpose instead of emptiness. "This is what I see when I look at you now," Anna said, offering him the drawing. "Your colors have changed. The dark ones are still there, but now they're mixed with bright ones that make everything more beautiful." Robert studied the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. "Anna," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Are you really just an 8-year-old girl from the South Side? Or are you something else? Someone else?" Anna was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain lifetimes of experience. When she spoke, her voice carried the same gentle authority that had characterized all their conversations, but with an added weight of finality. "I'm exactly who I've always been," she said. "But love is bigger than who we think we are. Sometimes love borrows different faces, different voices, different hands to do the work that needs to be done. I came because you needed to remember that miracles are real, that healing is possible, that love doesn't end when bodies stop working." The words settled over Robert like blessing and revelation combined. "Lily," he whispered, barely breathing the name that had lived in his heart like a wound for over a decade. Anna smiled, and for just a moment, Robert could see both children simultaneously, the daughter he'd lost and the friend who had found him, the past that had shaped him, and the future that still beckoned with possibility. "Love finds a way," she said simply. "Always." In the months that followed this final encounter, Robert found himself living a life that bore little resemblance to the existence he'd maintained since Lily's death. The mansion that had been a mausoleum became a home in the truest sense, not because it was filled with people, but because it was filled with purpose. Robert established a foundation dedicated to providing educational opportunities and emotional support for children from struggling families, particularly those who, like Anna, possessed gifts that transcended conventional understanding. The foundation's programs included scholarships for gifted children whose families couldn't afford private schooling, counseling services for families dealing with trauma and loss, and community gardens where children could learn to nurture growing things. Robert threw himself into this work with an energy that amazed everyone who had known him during his years of grief-stricken isolation. He visited schools in neighborhoods he'd never seen, sat on floors playing games with children whose names he learned and remembered, listened to stories of hardship and hope that reminded him daily of the resilience that lived in small hearts. The children didn't know about his wealth initially. They knew only that this tall, gentle man seemed genuinely interested in their thoughts and dreams, that he asked questions that showed he was really listening, that he had a way of making them feel heard and valued. Patricia, initially skeptical of Robert's new direction, gradually came to see that her brother had found his way back to authentic life. The foundation's work was concrete and measurable, its impact on individual children's lives documentable and impressive. The accusations of manipulation and exploitation that had surrounded his friendship with Anna seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of systematic assistance that helped dozens of families without asking for anything in return. The legal restrictions that had separated Robert from Anna were quietly lifted, though by that time the child had withdrawn from regular appearances in his life. Occasionally, he would glimpse her in the Foundation's programs, always helping other children, always present when someone needed exactly the kind of unique understanding she possessed. These sightings felt like blessings rather than chance encounters, confirmations that the work he was doing aligned with purposes larger than his individual healing. Susan Martinez became one of the Foundation's first employees. Her experience navigating the challenges of single parenthood in Chicago's struggling neighborhoods making her an invaluable advocate for the families they served. Her initial skepticism about Robert's intentions had evolved into deep respect for the consistency of his commitment and the authenticity of his transformation. She watched him interact with children who reminded him of both Anna and Lily, seeing him discover that love multiplied rather than diminished when it was given freely. The mansion itself had been transformed to accommodate its new purpose. Rooms that had stood empty for years now served as meeting spaces for families, art studios where children could express their experiences through creative media, quiet corners where individual counseling sessions helped young people process trauma and rediscover hope. The garden that had been barren for so long bloomed with vegetables and flowers tended by small hands, with fruit trees planted in memory of children who had taught adults important lessons about courage and faith. Years later, Robert would often find himself sitting by the window in his study, looking out over Lake Michigan's changing moods while reviewing progress reports from the Foundation's various programs. The financial statements he still reviewed showed a portfolio that continued to grow, but wealth had long since ceased to be his primary source of identity or security. The numbers on those reports represented possibility rather than possession, resources that could be transformed into opportunities for children who needed them. His desk held photographs now, but they were different from the shrine-like display that had dominated the space during his years of frozen grief. Lily's picture was there, but it was surrounded by images of other children, scholarship recipients who had graduated from college, families who had found stability through the Foundation's programs, community gardens that bloomed in neighborhoods where hope had seemed impossible. The photographs told stories not of loss, but of love's infinite capacity for regeneration and renewal. On quiet evenings, when Chicago's skyline glittered with promise and the lake reflected city lights like scattered stars, Robert sometimes sensed presences that weren't visible to ordinary sight. He had learned to recognize the subtle signs that love continued to influence the world, not through dramatic miracles, but through the small synchronicities that brought exactly the right people together at precisely the moments when they could help each other most effectively. Children would appear in his life bearing messages they didn't consciously understand, carrying wisdom that seemed to flow from sources deeper than their individual experience, offering insights that helped adults remember what they'd forgotten about wonder and possibility. Anna had been the first of these messengers, but not the last. Robert had learned to recognize the signs, the child who seemed to know more than their circumstances should have taught them, the young voice that spoke with authority beyond its years, the small presence that carried peace into spaces where conflict had seemed intractable. He no longer questioned the source of such gifts, no longer demanded logical explanations for mysteries that transcended conventional understanding. He had learned to receive miracles with gratitude rather than skepticism, to trust that love indeed found ways to visit people who needed it most. The Foundation grew beyond Robert's initial vision, establishing programs in other cities, developing new approaches to supporting families in crisis, creating models that other organizations could adapt to their own communities. Robert found himself traveling frequently, speaking at conferences about the intersection of private philanthropy and public service, consulting with other foundations about sustainable approaches to addressing childhood trauma and educational inequality. Yet, despite his expanding influence and growing recognition in philanthropic circles, Robert's most treasured moments remained simple and personal. The individual conversations with children who reminded him why this work mattered, the quiet encounters where healing occurred through nothing more complicated than genuine attention and unconditional positive regard. He had discovered that the fortune he'd spent decades accumulating was most valuable when it was given away, that the legacy he would leave would be measured not in dollars or assets, but in the number of young lives that had been touched by hope and transformed by love. On a spring morning when Chicago was waking from winter's lengthy sleep, when the trees along Michigan Avenue were budding with new life and Lake Michigan sparkled with renewed possibility, Robert found himself walking through Lincoln Park with the same sense of anticipation that had characterized his earliest meetings with Anna. He had no reason to expect an encounter. No appointment had been scheduled, no message had been received. Yet, something in the quality of the morning light, something in the way the wind carried scents of growing things, suggested that this day would bring its own form of revelation. He found Anna sitting on their old bench by the lagoon, but she was not alone. Beside her sat an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, someone Robert didn't recognize but who seemed familiar in ways he couldn't explain. Anna was older now, perhaps 12, carrying herself with the poise of someone who had always been mature beyond her chronological age. She looked up as Robert approached. and her smile carried the same warmth that had first drawn him beyond his defensive barriers years earlier. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, rising to greet him with the courtesy that had always characterized their interactions, "I'd like you to meet my grandmother, Elena. She's been wanting to talk with you." The elderly woman extended her hand with a grace that spoke of lifetimes of offering comfort to others. "Robert," she said, and her voice carried echoes of Anna's gentle authority, "I've heard so much about you. Anna tells me you've learned to see colors again." They sat together on the bench where Robert's transformation had begun, 3 generations connected by mysteries that transcended ordinary family relationships. Elena spoke of watching her granddaughter's work from a distance, of seeing how one man's healing had rippled outward to touch hundreds of other lives, of understanding that some children are born with assignments that extend far beyond their individual circumstances. "Anna has always been special," Elena explained, her accent carrying traces of places and times that enriched her words with additional meaning. "But her gift isn't just in seeing what others miss. It's in helping people remember what they already knew but had forgotten. You weren't broken, Robert. You were just sleeping, waiting for someone to remind you how to wake up." Anna reached into her pocket and withdrew one final drawing, this one more complex than any she had created before. It showed a garden where children of all ages played together under trees that bloomed in every season simultaneously, where time moved in gentle circles rather than harsh straight lines, where adults and children learned from each other without barriers of age or circumstance. In the center of the garden sat a fountain that never stopped flowing, and beside it stood figures that Robert recognized as himself, Anna, Lily, and countless other individuals whose lives had been touched by love's persistent presence. "This is what I see when I think about all the children who will be helped by your foundation," Anna said, offering him the drawing. "This is what happens when people remember that love doesn't end, it just finds new ways to grow." Robert accepted the drawing with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty, studying the intricate details that captured not just visual images, but emotional truths. The garden Anna had drawn looked exactly like the world he had been building through the foundation's work, a space where healing was possible, where children were valued for their unique gifts, where miracles occurred daily through the simple application of consistent love and attention. As spring deepened into summer and summer matured into autumn, Robert found himself thinking often about the conversation with Anna and Elena in Lincoln Park. The drawing Anna had given him hung in his office at the foundation, serving as both inspiration and reminder of the mystery that had initiated his transformation. The programs they had developed continued to expand, reaching more families, creating more opportunities, demonstrating more convincingly that systemic change was possible when individual healing was multiplied across communities. The children who participated in the Foundation's programs often displayed the same qualities that had first drawn Robert to Anna: sensitivity that bordered on supernatural insight, wisdom that seemed to flow from sources beyond their limited experience, capacity for empathy that transformed everyone around them. Robert had learned to recognize these gifts without trying to explain them, to create space where such children could develop their abilities without being labeled as different or strange. Some of the Foundation's most successful programs involved pairing these gifted children with adults who needed exactly the kind of gentle healing that only innocent wisdom could provide. The results were remarkable: elderly individuals discovering renewed purpose, business leaders remembering their humanity, families healing from traumas that had seemed insurmountable. The Foundation had inadvertently created a model for how society could better utilize the gifts that some children carried, how communities could become more receptive to the messages that love consistently tried to deliver through its youngest messengers. Yet despite the growth and recognition that surrounded the Foundation's work, Robert's most meaningful moments remained intensely personal. Each child who crossed his path carried the potential to be another Anna, another messenger, bearing exactly the insight or comfort or challenge that someone needed to receive. He had learned to approach these encounters with openness rather than skepticism, with gratitude rather than analysis, with trust in the fundamental goodness that lived at the heart of existence despite all evidence to the contrary. On quiet evenings, when the Foundation's offices were empty and Chicago's skyline settled into twilight's embrace, Robert would sometimes walk through the spaces where so many healing encounters had occurred. The walls held memories of conversations that had changed lives, of moments when understanding had bridged seemingly impossible gaps between people from different worlds. Every room carried the energy of transformation, the lingering presence of love that had been given and received without condition or expectation. In these moments of solitude, Robert often felt Lily's presence most strongly, not as the lost child whose absence had nearly destroyed him, but as the eternal daughter whose love had learned to speak through countless other voices, whose light had discovered infinite ways to shine through different eyes, whose laughter lived on in every child who rediscovered joy after experiencing loss. The Foundation had become her legacy as much as his life's work, a living memorial that created more life rather than simply commemorating what had ended. The staff who worked with Robert noticed how he had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize children who carried special gifts. He could spot them in crowded classrooms, identify them during community events, sense their presence even before they spoke. These children seemed drawn to him as well, approaching with the same inexplicable trust that Anna had shown during that first encounter in Lincoln Park. Robert had learned to welcome these connections without question, understanding that each one represented love's ongoing effort to heal the world through the smallest, gentlest messengers. The Foundation's influence extended beyond Chicago now, with satellite programs in Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee, each adapted to local needs while maintaining the core principle that had emerged from Robert's transformation. That children possess wisdom that adults need to hear, that healing often comes through unexpected sources, that miracles remain real for those willing to recognize them. Robert found himself traveling more frequently, consulting with other organizations, speaking at conferences where his story inspired others to look beyond conventional approaches to social change. But he always returned to Chicago, to Lincoln Park, to the bench where his journey had begun. Sometimes Anna was there, sometimes she wasn't, but her influence permeated every aspect of the work that had grown from their friendship. The Foundation had become a testament to the power of one child's gentle insistence that love never truly ends, only changes form. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Robert returned to Lincoln Park carrying a small gift, a music box that played Für Elise, Lily's favorite piece. He had planned to leave it on the bench if Anna wasn't there, a small tribute to the miracle that had transformed his life. But she was waiting, now a young teenager with the same dark eyes that had seen straight through his defenses years earlier. "Happy anniversary," she said with a smile that carried the wisdom of ages. "I brought something too." She handed him a letter, sealed in an envelope that bore his name in elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. "When you were ready to remember that love survives death, I appeared to help you remember. When other people are ready to remember the same thing, other messengers will appear for them. This is how the world heals itself, one heart at a time, one miracle at a time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. Thank you for helping others believe too. The work continues through you now. Love never ends. Lily." Robert looked up from the letter to find the bench empty, though he could have sworn Anna had been sitting there just moments before. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of children's laughter from the nearby playground, reminding him that love indeed found infinite ways to make itself known to those willing to see and hear and believe. And now, as our story draws toward its close, perhaps you find yourself sitting in your own quiet corner, wondering about the children who have crossed your path, with observations too wise for their years, with insights that seem to come from somewhere beyond their limited experience. Perhaps you've dismissed these moments as coincidence, these small voices as merely precocious. But what if they weren't? What if every child who has looked at you with eyes too knowing, who has spoken words that seemed meant specifically for your heart, who has appeared in your life at precisely the moment when you needed their particular brand of gentle wisdom? What if each of these encounters was love finding yet another way to remind you that miracles remain real, that healing stays possible, that hope continues to be warranted despite all evidence to the contrary? Robert Caldwell's transformation began with a bitter laugh at a small girl's claim to see his sadness. It continued through months of impossible encounters that challenged everything his rational mind believed about how the world worked. It culminated in the recognition that love operates according to laws that transcend human understanding, that death is not the ending we imagine it to be, that connection survives the dissolution of physical forms in ways that our hearts know even when our minds cannot fathom. The foundation that grew from this recognition now touches thousands of lives annually. Children who might have been overlooked by traditional social services find their gifts recognized and nurtured. Families struggling with poverty and trauma discover resources and support that help them heal and thrive. Adults who had forgotten how to see wonder rediscover their capacity for awe through interactions with young people who carry light in their eyes and truth in their voices. Perhaps most importantly, the foundation serves as a living reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest gestures: a child's willingness to speak truth to a grieving stranger, an adult's decision to listen with an open heart, love's persistent efforts to find new ways to heal the wounds that divide us from ourselves and each other. The last time Robert saw Anna, she was 16 years old, volunteering at one of the Foundation's summer programs. She was teaching art to children from the city's most challenged neighborhoods, helping them find ways to express experiences too complex for words. Robert watched from a distance as she moved among the young artists, offering encouragement, asking questions that drew out each child's unique vision, creating space where creativity could flourish without judgment or comparison. She looked up and caught his eye, offering a smile that acknowledged all they had shared and all that had grown from their unlikely friendship. Later, as the session ended and families came to collect their children, Anna approached Robert with a painting one of her students had created. It showed a garden where flowers grew in impossible colors, where children and adults walked together along winding paths, where fountains flowed with water that looked like liquid light. "Maria painted this," Anna said, indicating a shy girl who clung to her grandmother's hand near the door. "She told me it was a picture of heaven, but heaven for people who are still alive. I thought you'd want to see it." Robert studied the painting, recognizing themes that had appeared in Anna's own artwork years earlier: the circular garden, the fountain that never stopped flowing, the sense of time moving in gentle spirals rather than harsh straight lines. But this was Maria's vision, filtered through her own experience, expressed through her own young hands. "How many others are there?" Robert asked quietly, understanding without needing clarification that they were speaking about children who carried similar gifts, similar messages. "More than you might think," Anna replied. "Less than the world needs, but enough. There are always enough when people are ready to listen." As families departed and the afternoon light began to slant through tall windows, Anna gathered her things with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to treasure time without clinging to moments that had completed their purpose. She hugged Robert with the warmth of someone saying goodbye to a dear friend rather than farewell to a chapter of life. "Thank you," she said, "for remembering how to believe in impossible things. Thank you for showing others that miracles are still real. Thank you for helping love find new ways to work in the world." "Thank you," Robert replied, "for being exactly who I needed you to be, exactly when I needed you most." Anna smiled one last time and walked toward the door, where her grandmother Elena waited with the patient expression of someone who had witnessed many such partings. As they left together, Robert heard Anna's voice drift back through the summer air. "Love finds a way, always. Standing alone in the Foundation's art room, surrounded by children's paintings that captured visions of beauty too perfect for this world, yet somehow available to anyone willing to see with innocent eyes, Robert felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending kind of completion, but the kind that comes when one important phase of work transitions into the next. The Foundation would continue, would grow, would touch more lives, would create more opportunities for healing and transformation. Other children like Anna would emerge when they were needed, carrying messages that specific hearts were ready to receive. The work of helping love find new ways to express itself in a wounded world would continue, one encounter at a time, one opened heart at a time, one miracle at a time. And somewhere in Chicago, perhaps walking along Lake Michigan's shore, or sitting in Lincoln Park, or simply living the ordinary, extraordinary life of a teenager who carries ancient wisdom in young hands, Anna continues her work of reminding people that the most important truths often speak through the smallest voices, that the most profound healings often begin with the simplest gestures, that love never truly ends. It only finds new ways to bloom,